Good morning. Welcome to our Bible study this morning. This morning we're finishing our our series on cremation and burial. This is part number 2 of a 2-part series. Remember, in our last lesson we looked at the idea of the need for us to make sure that we glorify the Lord in our lives as Christians, even following our death. That includes making sure to the best of our ability that what takes place at our funeral will honor and glorify the Lord, as well as the disposition of our bodies. We talked about how the way that a body is taken care of following death shows not only respect and honor for the Lord, if it's taken care of properly, but also respect and honor for the loved one who has passed on before us. Keep in mind, our body is a gift from the Lord. It's given to us to use, but really the Lord's the one that possesses our body. So we're to be good stewards of that. We're to use our body in a way that's pleasing to the Lord, that will honor and glorify Him, even after our death. And so for the loved ones that are left behind, in recognition of the fact that they understand the Lord has given their loved one that body to use, and that really it's the Lord's body, they need to be sure that they take care of that body in a way that's pleasing to the Lord, following the death of their loved one. Likewise, they're showing honor and respect for the lifetime of their loved one. You know, if they were faithful Christians who wanted to glorify the Lord with their life, by them then taking care of their body in a way that's pleasing to the Lord, it shows respect and honor for the loved one as well that's passed on. So in my mind, the funeral itself, the services, and how the body is taken care of following death is a very important issue, because it involves that person's last chance to be a testimony to the lost who may be attending the funeral. And that's why I think it's so important. What we saw then in our study was, based upon the stewardship principle. And again, please go back and listen to the first lesson if you haven't already to get more of what I'm saying here. But based upon the stewardship principle, the principle that a person's body is owned by God and we simply use it for His glory, based upon that principle, we need to be certain that we take care of the body properly even after death. We saw how burial was obviously one way to properly take care of the body following its demise, the demise of the loved one. We saw how the Bible seemed to leave the idea of cremation much more in question. The Bible wasn't nearly as clear about the use of cremation in a way that honors and glorifies the Lord as it did burial. And here's why. If you remember, we saw 2 verses right at the end, 2 texts we looked at, that described the idea that in the Bible at times, people's bodies were burned to show disrespect. On purpose they showed disrespect. It was a public display. As they burned their bodies, it was a public display to everybody. This man was a wicked man. Do not follow his example. That type of idea. So, even though, again, we don't have a thus saith the Lord, following our first study, so far what we've seen is, when it comes to the stewardship principle, burial, we can rest assured, a burial is pleasing to the Lord. A burial honors and glorifies the Lord. That's the stewardship principle. When it comes to cremation, that's much more an open question, for the Bible isn't nearly as clear about the idea of cremation being something that honors and glorifies the Lord based on the stewardship principle. What I would like us to do is pick up from there now, and we'll look at principles 2 and 3. Next, we're going to look at the example set by honored Bible characters. Let me give you a list very quickly. In Genesis 49, 29 through 31, Genesis 49, 29 through 31, we find the following people were buried in tombs: Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, and Leah. Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, and Leah were all buried in tombs. Think about Lazarus, the resurrection of Lazarus, for example, in Mark 15:45. Lazarus was buried in a tomb. Remember, Jesus called him forth out of the tomb. And of course, we know that Christ Himself, we looked at this last time, Christ Himself was buried in a tomb. There's many, many other examples. I probably could give you 100 examples of different characters in the Bible that were buried in tombs. That was the common way people were buried, both in the Old and the New Testament. That's the common way that their body was disposed of following death. As far as Christians' bodies were disposed of following death, was by burial in a tomb, where they would prepare their bodies, then they would place those bodies in a tomb. But there are exceptions. And that's where, again, the waters get a little bit murkier for us. You know, to me, after the first lesson, in my mind, I'm pretty much certain, based upon the way you look at it from the first lesson, burial is the way to go. But in this lesson, you're going to see there are exceptions to that. And this is, again, where the waters get more murky. Okay? Turn with me, if you would, please, to 1 Samuel 31, 11 through 13. Here we have a case where bodies were burned to honor and glorify the Lord. Okay, now, again, as you're turning to 1 Samuel 31, 11 through 13, please keep in mind, okay? We have already seen where it is clear burial of a body does honor and glorify the Lord. So burials really aren't the question. I think the Bible is plain teaching that one of the acceptable ways of disposing of a body is through a burial. I don't think anybody could really dispute that. The real question before us is cremation also an accepted way to dispose of a body? Based on the last lesson, again, I really had a lot of questions about it after that first lesson. It seemed like the Bible was not nearly as clear about cremation, and there was some areas we saw where it would seem to say it's not acceptable. But here we find in 1 Samuel 31, 11 through 13, an example where bodies on purpose were cremated for the Lord's glory. Now listen to what's said. And when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard of that which the Philistines had done to Saul. Remember, the Philistines are the one that killed Saul and his sons, King Saul and his sons. When the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead had heard that the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose, went all night, and took the body of Saul and the body of his sons from the wall in Bethshan. Now get what happened. The Philistines killed King Saul and Saul's sons. King Saul was the man that God had placed in a position of authority over Israel. We know then later that God replaced him with David, but the point is he was still the acting king at the time he died. His sons were all a part of the royal family at the time that he died. And what did the Philistines do? To show their great victory over Israel and over Jehovah God, of whom they did not believe in, they hung the bodies of Saul and they hung the bodies of his sons on this wall in, I think it's Bashan is what it said. Yeah, this wall in Bethshan. So here you have a public display of the Philistines' great power in killing the Israelites' king and the royal family, and how the Philistines, by theory, had overcome Jehovah God, the Israel's God. So you have these valiant men sneaking in at night. They take the bodies down, and watch what they do. They came to Jabesh and burnt them there, so they cremate the bodies. They're cremating the bodies of Saul and his sons. They took their bones and buried them under a tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days. Here's kind of a combination. They burn the bodies, then what's left they bury. Why did they do that? It was to honor and glorify the Lord. They burned the bodies so the Philistines could not retake the bodies and hang them back up. They did not want the Israelites to be put to shame, nor did they want Jehovah to be put to shame. So by burning up the bodies, there's no way the Philistines could steal the bodies away from them and rehang them on the wall. Now, folks, in that case, you have a cremation that took place specifically to honor and to glorify the Lord. Okay, so in that case, we have to say there are at least some instances, depending on the circumstances surrounding the situation we're looking at, there are some instances where cremation can be used to glorify the Lord. And cremation would be the right thing to do. This is an example of that. Now, I know this. You might think, well, this is a far-fetched example and this wouldn't happen in today's time. Probably not. But I'm just saying this does help us to understand that cremation is not just an open and shut book where we can say every time a person is cremated it was the wrong thing to do. We just can't say that. That's my only point. I'm just saying we have to understand that at least in some circumstances, cremation is acceptable in the eyes of God. I believe these brave men will be honored by the Lord. If they were saved individuals, I believe they'll be honored by the Lord for being willing to risk their lives to take down the body of Saul and his sons and bring them back and burn them for the sake of his glory. They were risking their lives for the sake of making sure the Lord wasn't put to an open shame. So at least in one instance we find where cremation certainly, in my mind, was pleasing to the Lord. But there's another time. Look, if you would please, at Amos 6. Amos 6, verse number 7. Now in this case again, we have bodies being cremated. And again, my way of thinking is, in this instance, it seems as if it was the proper thing to do. Therefore now shall they go captive with the first that go captive, and the banquet of them that stretch themselves shall be removed. The Lord God hath sworn by himself, saith the Lord God of hosts, I abhor the excellency of Jacob, and I hate his palaces. Therefore I will deliver up the city with all that is therein. The Lord, out of justifiable wrath against the Israelites, now says he's going to take his blessings from them and he's going to bring harm upon them because of their sinfulness, in an effort to teach them the error of their ways and in an effort to glorify and honor himself, to show himself as the righteous, just God. If there remain 10 men in one house, that they shall die. And it shall come to pass, if there remain 10 men in one house, that they shall die. What happened, most people believe, is the Lord sent a plague on the land to punish the people for their sins. And a part of that plague was a communicable disease type thing that brought death to many. And a man's uncle shall take him up, and he that burneth him, to bring up the bones out of the house. And shall say unto him that is by the sides of the house, Is there yet any with thee? And he shall say, No. Then shalt thou say, Hold thy tongue, for we may not make mention of the name of the Lord. For behold, the Lord commandeth, he will smite the great house with breaches, and the little house with clefts. These men that are at work here are men who honor the Lord. In the process of this plague, they're taking bodies out of the house and burning them. Okay, what's the reasoning behind that? It's to make sure, to try and stop the plague from spreading. Once again, in this case, it seems as if this isn't done as an act of rebellion against the Lord. As a matter of fact, it's done in an attempt to show kindness and love toward others by trying to stop this plague that's come upon them. And they use the method of cremation to try to stop this plague, which makes sense. If these men that are in the house die, and if they're sick with a communicable disease, sometimes it's necessary to burn bodies to try and stop that disease from spreading. So I'm just pointing this out as another example where at times, based on the circumstances of each individual situation, there may be times when cremation is the best thing to do. I mean, believe me, I realize that cremation isn't simply an issue. It's not a simple issue because there's a lot involved with it, like, for example, finances. Folks, I realize it is a lot more expensive to do burials than it is to have a body cremated. I understand that. And sometimes money is a real factor in things. If you have a very poor family that's destitute, they truly may not have the money for a burial, where they just don't have it. It's impossible for them to bury a body, and they can't get money to do it. What do you do in that case? That's just one example. I'm just saying, it all depends on the situation at hand concerning cremation. Again, for the most part, I would say the Bible is clear that burial is a very accepted practice, and man, if you want to play it safe, and if you possibly can, that's the way to go. But there are extenuating circumstances. If someone dies of a communicable disease and they want to burn the body, and you say, no, no, don't, because that's not pleasing the Lord. Well, in that circumstance, it might be an okay thing to do. You're showing love towards others, not wanting the disease to spread. Again, the issue of money is a factor. I realize that in these decisions. What do you do if a family is truly destitute? Truly. Maybe the husband is the one that dies. He was the breadwinner in the family. He had no life insurance. They were poor people. The husband dies. There is absolutely no money to bury the husband. None. I mean, it's just not there. The wife can't borrow the money for whatever reason. If he was the only breadwinner, it would be hard for the wife to go to a bank and borrow money. What do these people do? My understanding is the most inexpensive burial is still much more expensive than cremation. And from what I understand, I'm no funeral director, maybe I'm wrong about that, but from what I understand, there is a big cost difference, even to the least amount you would have done at a burial, between buying the plot, buying the most inexpensive coffin that you could find, and preparing the body. It's far more expensive than cremation. What would a person do if they truly cannot, if there's just no possible way that they have finances to have a body that's buried? What do you do? See, these are, again, some of the issues why I'm not going to just take a stance and say, every time cremation takes place, it's wrong. Well, you can see in the Bible they give examples where it's not always wrong, depending on the circumstances or situation a person is in. But once again, let me just say, and I'll be clear about this, the Bible makes it plain there is nothing wrong with the burial. To me, as long as the burial can be done, that's the way it should be done. But there are exceptions when it comes to cremation. And that's where this, again, gets to be very murky about this. Okay, let's go on. Not only that, not only do we find cremation used twice at least in ways that seem to be pleasing to the Lord, but also think about believers' bodies and what took place back then. Besides the norm of having the body prepared and placed in a tomb, remember what Hebrews 11 says? In Hebrews 11, 32 through 40, we find a list of a tremendous number of believers with different things happening to their bodies after they pass on. Listen to this list. This is Hebrews 11, 32 through 40. What shall I more say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, of Barak, of Samson, and of Jephthah, David also, and Samuel, and of the prophets. Folks, these are all men who exercised a tremendous amount of faith in the Lord, to the point many of them gave their lives for the Lord. So this isn't an issue of them being ungodly men who didn't have their bodies buried or didn't have their bodies taken care of in the right way. These were some of the most godly men in the Bible, and their bodies weren't taken care of like they should have been. Listen to this. Who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises. Now here we go. Stopped with the mouths of lions. Certainly, some men of faith were able to stop the mouths of lions like Daniel. But you know what? There were many great Christians who were placed in the den of lions that were eaten by lions. What happened to their body? It certainly wasn't buried, nor was it cremated. It was eaten by lions. Quenched with the violence of fire. Again, certainly there were some Christians who the Lord worked miraculously, and in one way or the other stopped them from being burned at the stake. But you know what? There were many that were burned at the stake over the years. Now, I realize being burned at the stake isn't quite the same as cremation, because you're talking about a person who's still living being burned alive. But you do have to say the result of being burned alive will be the same as cremation. Their physical bodies were still burned in the process. It's just they happened to have life within them as they were burning. But still, my point is, their body still wasn't buried. It still was burned up. They escaped the edge of the sword. Okay, how many Christians certainly escaped the edge of the sword, but there were many who died by the edge of the sword. And normally, what would they do? Their bodies would lay out in the field. We saw that in the previous lesson, where their enemies wouldn't take time to bury their bodies or to cremate their bodies. They would lay out in the field. The bodies would decay and turn back to dust in the field after being eaten by all sorts of animals. Drop down a little bit. Others had trials of cruel mockings and scourgings. Moreover, they wandered about, bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawed asunder. There you have one, sawed asunder. What happened to that poor man's body when they were cut in half? In many cases, I'm sure their bodies weren't given a proper burial, nor were they cremated. They were probably cut in half, and I guess probably either laying in the streets or somehow put on display for the people to see the victory they'd gotten over God's people. In many cases, that would happen. They were stoned, sawn asunder, tempted, slain with the sword. They wandered about with sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, afflicted, tormented. My point in seeing these is, folks, we have to understand something, okay? There are many cases where a Christian's body was mistreated. They weren't taken care of properly at all. And yet it still, in that case, was an action to honor and glorify the Lord on the part of the person giving their life. Why were their bodies mistreated? It's because these people were willing to die for their Lord. In this case, instead of a mistreated body being a shame to those who are living, it was an honor to those who have passed away. It was an honor to those who passed away because it was a declaration to all what they were willing to give up for the name of Christ. Paul himself, 1 Corinthians 13:3. Remember what Paul said? And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, and have not charity, it profit me nothing. Now, once again, the idea there is he's not saying he's giving his body to be cremated. He's saying he's willing to die at the stake, burned at the stake if he need be. But once again, you can see where Paul understood. There were times when a Christian would actually willingly allow his body to be mistreated when, based upon the circumstance, he was doing it for the honor and the glory of the Lord. So I guess what I'm saying in all of this so far is this. In the big picture of things, the main idea is what glorifies the Lord the most. In the case of martyrs, it was allowing their bodies to be mistreated. In the case of most Christians back then, it was through burial, laying in a tomb. In some cases, you could even see where it seemed as if cremation honored and glorified the Lord based on the circumstances, the extenuating circumstances of the day. The point is, no matter what, the key is what glorifies the Lord in any situation that we're facing. Based upon the situation of the family, based upon the situation of the departed loved one, based upon all the different circumstances, that's how we have to view this. To come to a conclusion what is the best way for the body to be taken care of. That's the lesson we learn from the examples in the Bible. Once again, in general, it seemed to be the norm for burial. But there were exceptions. And in each case, those exceptions were, the decision was made based upon what glorified and honored the Lord the most. That's how these decisions were come to, whether it was to cremate, whether it was to bury, or whether it was to allow some other horrible death take place that involved abuse of the body for the sake of God's honor and glory. Finally, I would like us to look at the symbolism involved. And for some people, I know you're probably thinking ahead of me on this one, and you're saying this is the one that clinches it. When you look at the symbolism of fire, it clinches the need for burial. I used to think that. I got to tell you, even as a pastor for many years, I thought that. Let's look at the symbolism of fire to start with. Psalm 89:46. If there was ever a verse in the Bible that clearly explains one of the symbolisms of fire, this is it. Psalm 89:46. How long, Lord, wilt thou hide thyself forever? Shall thy wrath burn like fire? The idea of the Lord's judgment and wrath is pictured by fire. Throughout the Bible, you can see it over and over again where God would send judgment upon people, he would send wrath upon people, and by doing that he would be sending fire. That's how he would do it. So throughout the Bible, both Old, New, well, especially in the Old Testament, fire was a symbol of God's wrath, God's judgment. So in the minds of many, the idea is if we cremate a body, it's as if we are symbolically saying that body is going to face eternal judgment. We're symbolically saying that person is a lost person who will face, eternal judgment. He'll have fire come upon him. Matter of fact, there are some people who say they want to be cremated because they believe they'll escape the final judgment that way. Well, let me tell you folks, like I said before, if the Lord can create our body out of dust to start, he can recreate our body out of ashes. It doesn't matter what takes place to our body when it comes to the idea of the resurrection. It doesn't matter. A lion could eat the body and the Lord's still going to remake it when it comes time for our resurrection. So that's not really an issue, and for some people it is, but biblically it's not. There's nothing we can do to our bodies that will cause our bodies to escape the final resurrection. So if we think we're going to escape God's eternal judgment because we have our bodies destroyed after we're gone, sorry. The Bible is plain on that. What we're talking about here is the idea, the symbolism of fire. There are many that believe because fire does symbolize God's wrath, which it does throughout the Bible, that is a clincher there. The last thing we want to do is have a body burned. Man, that's picture God's wrath falling upon that body. That's the last thing we want to do. Well, again, that's what I used to think as a pastor for many years. The problem is this. The more I studied it, the more we realized there's more than one symbol for fire in the Bible. Fire symbolizes God's wrath, but there's more to it than that. Not only does fire symbolize God's wrath, but fire can also symbolize acceptance by God. If you turn with me to Leviticus 9:23 and 24. Here we find that the Lord is accepting an offering from the people. Do you know how he did it? By sending fire down from heaven. Listen to what's said in Leviticus 9. And there came a fire out from before the Lord and consumed upon the altar the burnt offering and the fat. That was an act of him accepting that offering. You have the same basic thing in Judges 8. Where it talks about in verses 19 through 24. I'll just pick out a few select verses of Judges 8, 19 through 24. I'm sorry, Judges 6. I can't even read. Judges 6, 19 through 24. Listen to this. Then the angel of the Lord put forth the end of the staff that was in his hand and touched the flesh and the unleavened cakes. There rose up fire out of the rock and consumed the flesh and the unleavened cakes. Folks, there are times when the Lord doesn't use fire to send his wrath, but he actually sent fire to accept something to heaven. Remember the altar of incense. What happened there? The smoke from the altar would rise up to God in heaven, showing that he what? Accepted our prayers. Think about in the New Testament, during the day of Pentecost, you have fire coming down from heaven, lighting on those who were receiving the gift of tongues. By the way, just as a side note, please keep in mind, the gift of tongues has both a seeing part and a hearing part. Not only do people speak in tongues, but a part of the gift of tongues is having that fire come down upon them. Keep that in mind. So when a person claims they have the gift of tongues, they're speaking in tongues, but there's no fire coming down from them. There's a reason to question whether that's the biblical gift. We'll get into a lot more of that in our series on the charismatic movement later in 2014. I'll be doing a series on that. But for now, the point is, when you think about the day of Pentecost, fire coming down, that certainly wasn't God's wrath falling upon his people in the church of Jerusalem. Just the opposite. It was great blessing of the Lord as he was blessing them with the miraculous ability to speak in languages that were known by other men, but they did not know themselves. So they could witness to people that spoke other languages than themselves. So to say the fire always represents God's judgment, and therefore we should never cremate a body because that's a picture of God's judgment falling upon it, the deeper we study God's word, the more we understand that just ain't so. It can also picture God's acceptance, God's pleasure with people, God's blessings falling upon people. So when it comes to that, what happens when we cremate a body? Well, if you look at it in one way, yeah, it could picture God's wrath falling upon that body. But if you look at it another way, it could look like God's blessings upon that person and his acceptance of that person and their body into heaven at their time of the resurrection. So again, based upon the symbolism of fire, to me that's a wash. It depends on which symbol you're going to use, which symbol for that fire is used for in the Bible. Which one you use is going to dictate whether it be proper to cremate somebody or not. So that's a wash. To me, the symbolism of fire doesn't really help us in any way in our quest to know whether cremation is proper or not. Okay, that's the study of the symbolism of fire. Very quickly, let's look at the study of the symbolism of burial. In 1 Corinthians 15, 35 through 49, we are told, and you can read those verses later, 1 Corinthians 15, 35 through 49, we are told that the death of a loved one is pictured like seed being buried in the ground. Okay, their body, the dead body of the loved one, is pictured like seed being buried in the ground that someday will arise again like a plant sprouting out of the ground. Well, planting a seed in ground certainly, symbolically, is best represented by placing a body in the tomb where it's covered by ground. So one of the symbolisms of a burial is this. It's the symbolism of a person's body being like a seed that is placed in the ground. That seed will not remain in the ground lifeless, but someday it will sprout back up out of the ground with new life. Of course, which is a picture of the resurrection of the believer's body and the new life they have in Christ, as they're resurrected, taken up to heaven, to be set totally apart from sin. So when we talk about the symbolism of burial, that's one big symbol of burial that's important. It's a what's the term I want to use? It's a affirmation of the fact the body will rise again someday. That's why we're taking such good care of it before it's placed in the ground. We don't expect it to just go out of existence and never see it again. No, it's going to rise again someday. And it'll rise again like a plant who has its seed previously was planted in the ground and now it rises up out of the ground. Not only that, there are places in the Bible that death, the body of a saved person at death is described as sleeping. That's why the Bible talks about Christians sleeping. It's talking about their body. The Christian doesn't sleep at death. He goes home to be with the Lord. His spirit goes home to be with the Lord. His body is as it's sleeping in the ground. Why does the Bible call a Christian's body sleeping in the ground? It's because someday it will rise up again. Just like somebody who laid down on their bed and fell asleep, they'll rise again someday. Well, again, that's the picture of taking care of a body and placing it in the tomb. It's like that person now is laying in the tomb sleeping, someday going to rise up again. Does burning a body properly picture a seed being planted in the ground? Or does burning a body properly picture a person who has fallen asleep who will rise again someday? Again, I would have to say probably not. By far, burial would be the best choice if we want to represent the fact that a Christian's body will someday rise again, like a seed planted in the ground, or like somebody who has fallen asleep. Finally, in Hebrews 2, 1 through 4, talking about Christ, the children are partakers of flesh and blood. He also likewise took part of the same, that through death he might destroy them, that the power of death, that is the devil. Speaking about how Christ took on a physical body on himself so he could experience death, just like each one of us. Christ set the example for each one of us. When Christ died on the cross and then rose again the third day, that's an example for each one of us that we're going to follow that as Christians. Someday we will physically die unless we're blessed enough to be living when the Lord comes back. But for most of us Christians, and for the Christians throughout the ages so far, they've all had to face death at one time or another. But their bodies will rise again, just like Christ. So Christ is the one that set the example for us. You have that in 1 Corinthians 15, 20 through 23, where Christ is called the first fruits of them that slept. Philippians 3, 20 through 21. Again, it talks about how Christ's body was changed, just like our body will be changed in Philippians 3, 20 through 21. In all of those, the point is Christ set an example for us to follow. Christ set an example of what's going to take place to a believer's body in the future. When we see his body placed in the tomb and rising again, that was an example for us of what our bodies will go through. Okay, so again now I ask, compare cremation to burial. Which type of disposition of the body would best picture Christ's body and what it went through? Because remember, he is our example to follow. If that's the case, again, it would seem to me that the best way to take care of the disposition of a body was by placing it in a tomb and having it come forth someday, just like Christ was, as compared to burning the body up. I know people say, well, his body was placed in a tomb, not buried in the ground, and they make an issue over the fact that burials today really aren't like burials back then. I agree, they're not. But the same basic principle applies in both. When a body was laid in a tomb and a rock, a stone, a boulder was rolled over the front of the tomb, what happened at that point in time? You have the body entirely surrounded by dirt and rock. What's buried on the ground? Entirely surrounding the body by dirt and rock. Instead of placing it in a cave, we're placing it under the ground, but still it's the same basic principle. We're placing it in a position where it's out of nature, the forces of nature's influence on it. It's underground, surrounded by ground. So certainly the way that we bury is more like how Christ's body was taken care of than cremation would be. Okay, so to summarize very quickly, what have we seen? Folks, for those who have Christian loved ones who have passed on, let me tell you, you can feel comfortable burying them. The Bible is plain. The many different aspects we looked at, in every case, if you notice, burial fit fine. So if you have the means, by all means, I would say bury them. If for some reason you're trying to make a choice between burial and cremation, again, to me, burial, you're safe. Cremation is very, very much a questionable thing. And what you need to do is go over these three things we've gone over with. Ask the Lord to give you grace. You know, these three Bible principles we looked at. Ask the Lord to give you grace to show you what's proper in your set of circumstances. Because we know even though a vast majority of times burial would be the proper method, there are exceptions to that. And I'm the first one to admit that. That's why this isn't an easy issue. And it's an issue of seeking the Lord through His Word, seeking the Lord through prayer. And I'm sure the Lord will make it more clear to you as you make your decision which way would be most pleasing to Him. Keep in mind what you want to do, whatever decision you make, you want to glorify the Lord the most. That's the basic idea behind this. In your situation, in your circumstances, in what way is the Lord glorified in the best way? In what way is this going to be a good testimony for the lost around you? It's those type of things that you have to look at when you decide concerning cremation, whether you should or not. Burial, you're safe. Cremation, I believe, in many instances, it's wrong to do. But there are those exceptions. And so if cremation in your circumstances glorifies the Lord in a greater way than a burial, you need to cremate. If using a cremation is a better way to reach the lost for some reason in the situation you're in, you need to cremate. But I would say in the vast majority of situations, burial is by far the safest way that honors and glorifies the Lord and shows respect and honor for the deceased loved one. I hope this study has helped you a little bit to understand more, at least some of the principles in the Bible that can help us to make up our minds about this very important subject. Lord bless you as you study His Word.